You are listening to the Ready PDM Network.
Today's episode was brought to you by Eigenworks. Most companies don't know why they lose deals, and few know why they win. Eigenworks can tell you why. With the buyer as hero approach, Eigenworks gets deep insight into the reasons organizations make buying decisions. The product, promotion, and sales insights provide Eigenworks clients with a significant competitive position in their marketplaces.
Are you ready?
For people that don't know who Satoshi is, can you explain?
So Satoshi Nakamoto is the creator of Bitcoin. He took several different technologies that existed at the time and created this combination that provides the fundamental innovation behind Bitcoin, which is the ability to have global consensus on a distributed ledger.
The main reason I'm here is to clear my name that I have nothing to do with Bitcoin, nothing to do with developing. I was just an engineer doing something else. I just believe that somebody put that fictitious name in there. Mm-hmm. Satoshi Nakamoto and Bitcoin.
Blockchain is definitely one of the more complicated computer software topics that has really taken the attention of the world by storm in the past couple of years.
No one, Mr. Mulder.
Right now, I would say that the two biggest camps is the Bitcoin blockchain on one side and the Ethereum protocol on the other.
Ethereum is a planetary scale computer powered by blockchain technology. Applications built on Ethereum run exactly as programmed, without any possibility of downtime, censorship, or third-party interference. Ethereum is the secure backbone for everything from e-commerce to the Internet of Things, enabling transparent governance for communities and businesses while keeping user communication secure. Mix, the Ethereum IDE, makes it easy to develop, debug, and deploy your applications, while building UIs is done using your existing web development skills, tools, and favorite frameworks. Ethereum handles user authentication and secure payments for you, as well as messaging and even decentralized storage. And there's no need to sign up or pay for servers to host your applications, as Ethereum is the world's first zero infrastructure platform, allowing your users to regain control over the management of their own funds and personal data. Join the many already developing on Ethereum.
It's time for Who Do You Trust? Hubba, hubba, hubba. Money, money, money. Who do you trust?
Trust is a funny thing, especially in a world such as this. It takes a world to build up, can be shattered in an instant.
One really big one that I find is fascinating is the concept of identity management. Okay, so the idea here is that the end user regains control over their own identity. There was a lot of hesitation from the large financial institutions of, is this going to eat my lunch? And I mean, it's important to understand that blockchain is very new.
Hello, Ready Product Radio heads, and welcome to another exciting episode of Ready Product Radio. This week, we have another perspective on blockchain technology. Being ready involves staying on top of industry trends in technology, and according to Gartner, blockchain has just exited what it calls the trough of disillusionment, which means it should be coming mainstream soon. In this episode, we talk to Iliana Oris Valiente, co-founder of Rubix by Deloitte, a company that helps clients understand and leverage blockchain technology for any use case. Ready Product Principle number 15 is never bring a knife to a gunfight. Stay current. In technology, there are two types of product people, the quick and the dead. Enjoy the show. Iliana Oris Valiente, it's good to have you on Product Radio. Thank you for joining us. You and I know each other from a recent Product Hunt Toronto. But why don't we start with you giving us an introduction of yourself. If you could, talk about your quote-unquote day job and, give us a little background on yourself, and then we can get into our topics for today.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Alan, for having me here today. I'm very excited. I guess in terms of introductions, my name is Iliana Oris Valiente. I'm a chartered accountant by training, and in terms of my day job, I am one of the co-founders of Rubix by Deloitte. We are an enterprise platform that specializes in blockchain technology, and we have both a technology team as well as a technology product that we're bringing to market. As far as my role goes, I lead the strategy, business development, and more of the product and operations side of the business. And prior to jumping into the blockchain world, I come from a more traditional finance, corporate finance, M&A, valuations type of environment. And I've done a lot of work with technology companies as well as some more traditional industries. And interestingly enough, all of these experiences combined with the fact that I used to be an auditor in a past life, have culminated and have enabled me to now leap fully into blockchain technology and the product world.
Awesome. That's great. So, Iliana, what we do at the Ready Product Radio podcast is it's really designed for product people of all disciplines. So we don't just talk about and with product managers, but entrepreneurs, new technologies like we're going to be talking about today. So I really appreciate you taking the time. So what I usually do, Iliana, is there's usually, I find 3 topics is about the right length for a podcast. So with yourself, what I thought we would do is let's very quickly, just for those who may not know what blockchain's about, quickly just get a summary from you, Blockchain 101, what it is. And why we need it. And then I'd like to go on and talk about some of the technology side because I didn't understand half of the buzzwords that we were discussing at the Product Hunt Toronto, but that sounded interesting, and the platforms and whatnot. And then I thought as the third piece, we'd look at, okay, now that we have a bit of a foundation of understanding, what are some of the things that people are doing with blockchain technologies? What are some of the applications they're developing? And I also want to get your perspective on, are blockchain applications ready for prime time, or are we still at the early stages? So do those 3 topics sound good?
Yep, that makes perfect sense.
Okay, great. So why don't we start just for people that may not be aware of what blockchain really is. I'm sure everybody's heard about it, but give me your definition, just blockchain 101, what it is. And specifically, I've heard that it has something to do or some relationship with Bitcoin. So maybe if you could talk about the origins of blockchain technology and the history of it and really why the universe needs something called blockchain. That would be a good start, I think.
Perfect. So blockchain is definitely one of the more complicated computer software topics that has really taken the attention of the world by storm in the past couple of years. It was actually founded originally in 2008 in the form of Bitcoin. And there was an infamous white paper issued by a pseudonymous author by the name of Satoshi, Satoshi Nakamoto. And so since then, blockchain went from being a technology that was really only known about in the underground garages of the computer scientists and the software developers who follow very closely the developments in the open source community. And in the past couple of years, it's garnered attention from more traditional large enterprises in figuring out what does this technology mean for their daily operations. Fundamentally, what a blockchain is a decentralized, distributed ledger. That's a lot of words. But fundamentally, what blockchain does is it distributes the storage of information, whether it's financial information or other, across a number of parties that may not trust each other. And it's this element of trust that is the true revolution and the reason that blockchains have gained so much attention in the first place. Let's give a very simple example of money transfers. If I owe Alan, let's say $10 from the Product Hunt event that we were at a couple of weeks ago. Instead of sending him $10 in normal Canadian dollars, which requires me to essentially make a request of my bank then transfers the money into Alan's bank. And then Alan's bank allows that money to be withdrawn from Alan's account. He could request that I send the money to him directly in Bitcoin. So earlier you mentioned that Bitcoin and blockchain are related, which is absolutely correct. In the case of Bitcoin, I could initiate a transaction that the funds go directly to you without ever requiring the need of an intermediary. And that is a huge breakthrough because traditionally, every transaction that we go through, whether it's financial, whether it's us dealing with the healthcare system or other public service entity, we are always relying on centralized intermediaries to help us process transactions. And as soon as you have a central intermediary, it means that you could have one point of failure. And we hear about this all the time with a credit card company losing financial records and having hundreds of thousands of credit card numbers completely lost, or records are then stolen, or records are resold against the permission of the end user. So the blockchain, by allowing a group of computer nodes, and a node is essentially a participant in this network, each of the nodes records every transaction that has ever happened. So if my system goes down tomorrow, it doesn't mean that the rest of the network is also compromised. And so before I'm able to send this $10 to you in Bitcoin, the network verifies that I actually have $10 worth of Bitcoin in my account and that I haven't simultaneously tried to spend that $10 of Bitcoin by sending it to somebody else. And it's a double spend problem that Bitcoin really was able to address. And when you think about the layers of Bitcoin versus blockchain, Bitcoin sits on top of an iceberg, and it's one application of the technology. And the underlying technology that enables it to operate is what's called the blockchain. So that's kind of the 101 and how the two subjects are related.
Yeah, that's good. So let's talk a little bit then about the types of problems that it can solve. But I'll just kind of recap. That's what I thought you were going to say. So it seems to mirror basically the value proposition, if you will, of the internet itself, with no single point of failure. And having that level of redundancy. And then the other thing I heard you say is the removal of an intermediary. You mentioned that as a security thing. I also potentially, and you correct me if I'm wrong, would see that maybe as a time savings as well. Because I know when I do, for example, PayPal transactions, let's say with somebody in the US, there's typically some time delay there. So is that a benefit as well, that the settlement is kind of instantaneous and therefore you don't have the time delays as well?
Absolutely. So with the Bitcoin blockchain, there is a program that essentially enforces all transactions to wait for a certain period of time before they are confirmed by the network. But unlike dealing with a traditional financial institution where you're dealing with two backend institutions at least, with the Bitcoin blockchain, you're just waiting for the network to confirm a transaction. And that's a 10-minute delay, as opposed to waiting T plus 3 days for a traditional bank transfer, or potentially even longer if you're sending money internationally. And then there's also the element of cost. Today, if I wanted to send via Western Union or any other payment processor $100 of Canadian to another country, the fees that I'm paying on that could be $5, $10, $15, $20, depending on where I'm sending that money to. Whereas with the Bitcoin transactions, you're looking at fractions of a penny as opposed to that heavy burden. And then in terms of some of the other benefits, you're absolutely right. As soon as you start removing intermediaries, you're simplifying the number of steps that are required in any sort of a process, which results in efficiencies. And I think this explains why a number of financial institutions are exploring what this technology means for them and how they may be able to leverage it in their back-end processes.
Yeah, and we can talk about that in a little bit. So is it just, so my next question is, again, still at the 101 level, is this just of interest for financial applications and financial industry, or are there other use cases where the blockchain, can be used? Because you mentioned a distributed ledger. A lot of people, a lot of businesses might think, ledger's not really that central to my business. Is it just financial services, or are there other applications that, or problems? Let's not talk about applications yet. What problems that the blockchain can solve?
Not at all. So the financial applications are the first area that got a lot of attention because it's a very simple use case to wrap your head around. It solves an evident problem today. However, the applications of this distributed ledger are very, very far ranging. I've actually seen personally applications in the healthcare space. And in that perspective, you're looking at electronic medical records that today, as an individual, I go to a doctor, I have a procedure done, and there's a record stored in that specific healthcare institution. However, if I move tomorrow and I move to the US, I go to that doctor, their way of finding out about my medical history is to ask me, have you had any major surgeries? Have you had any allergic reactions? To which my answer is no, or maybe, but perhaps I had an allergic reaction when I was 6 and I simply don't recall. And that record is sitting in a hospital in a different country, in a different state where there's zero data sharing.
Right.
And each of those institutions is also subject to being that central point of failure with all of my electronic medical records. And when you think in a health context of all the different parties that need to be involved as part of providing healthcare services to me, it's the insurance companies that pay the reimbursement for the services I'm provided. It's the healthcare practitioner. It's all of the various government departments and the ministries of health that want to keep tabs on aggregate information on all individuals and the types of procedures that they're having and the types of outbreaks that they're recording for epidemiology purposes. What blockchain enables is the connection point of all of these different stakeholders and the sharing of information in a secure manner that cannot be tampered with, but that's also very efficient. So in terms of applications, yes, there's healthcare, there's financial services. We're seeing a lot of interest from the public sector. There have been applications in supply chain as well. So how do you ensure that the food product or the luxury handbag that you've purchased actually comes from where the label says it came from? And we know that counterfeit goods, whether it's in consumer products or if it's in pharmaceuticals, which is far more dangerous, are legitimate business problems.
So what I've taken away from that, Iliana, is basically, financial is the low-hanging fruit conceptually, but really, when you look at any exchange, let's use that word, of a group of participants, this can be helpful. And the exchange doesn't have to be monetary value. It could be information, could be tickets. It could be, one of the guys we were talking to at the product event had this idea about a civic donation type of system, right? So am I reading that correctly? That really it's the security of the exchange between the parties, because like you say, they don't have to trust each other.
Correct. So you'll often hear the term token being used in reference to blockchain systems. And a token can really be used to represent absolutely anything, which actually leads me to kind of the evolution of blockchain. So we had talked about the Bitcoin blockchain. That's very well suited for the transfer and the exchange of value of monetary goods. The Bitcoin blockchain can also be adapted for a number of other use cases, but that wasn't its primary purpose. And so in the wake of blockchain 1.0 evolution, now there's a new protocol that's called Ethereum. And you may have heard of the Ethereum frontier. And many refer to it as blockchain 2.0. And the true innovation behind Ethereum is that they've taken the concept of a distributed ledger of the Bitcoin blockchain and have added an element of a smart contract. Now, the term smart contract can be a bit of a misnomer. Many people think, it's a piece of legal paperwork that has been automated electronically. That's not correct. A smart contract is a set of computer code, computer programming logic that is self-executing. It's a program. It runs exactly as coded in a distributed fashion. So as soon as the smart contract is written, it's published to the blockchain. So all of the nodes can actually see the details and are involved in ensuring that the contract continues to run in the way that it was initially programmed to. And it's this smart contract application that really enables many of the use cases that people think about when they start expanding the scope of this distributed ledger in applications beyond financial services.
Okay, good. Well, that's probably a good jumping off point then to get into some of the technology. So let's talk next about how the technology is delivered and built. I know in the early days, for example, let's say, before there were huge database vendors like Oracle or IBM or what have you, that companies doing applications would have to build their own data stores, for example, and then databases came along and the company said, okay, that's good. We can focus on our core business logic. What's the situation with blockchain? You mentioned this Ethereum. Are there a set of off-the-shelf technologies yet that companies can just pick up and have a lot of the commonality or the plumbing, so to speak, done? Or are we still at a stage where, no, you've really got to build the thing from the ground up?
A couple of comments around your question. It's important to distinguish between fully public blockchain systems, such as the Bitcoin blockchain or Ethereum, and what we call private blockchain instances. Okay. And in between those two extremes, you can also have a semi-private blockchain, also called a consortium blockchain. Okay. So in terms of off-the-shelf solutions, quote unquote, a company today could very well take information that they have in their existing databases, take a hash of it, so essentially encrypted so that it becomes unreadable to an outside third party, and record that onto one of these publicly available blockchains. What that does is provide the company with an irrefutable source of proof that they can point to and say, listen, I recorded this transaction at this time and I have not altered it. Because as soon as you alter it and you try to rehash it, the hash would not be the same due to the secure encryption algorithms that are involved as part of this process. In a private blockchain instance, a lot of businesses are trying to figure out what is the application of blockchain to my company, but more broadly to my industry. And in this sense, the technology differs from a database. So traditionally, businesses are focused on their own business problems internally within their four walls. What database structures do we use? What business logic are we solving for? Think of blockchain as being a level above that you would still have your traditional database systems and your own business logic, but you can now use a blockchain to connect the flow of information between you and all of the counterparties that you may deal with within a specific instance. And so when you get into these consortium networks, you need to figure out what is the compatibility between my legacy systems and these new systems, but at least it provides a common infrastructure to be able to build business logic at that industry level as opposed to at the individual company level. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. And imagine that's good news because one of the things that I know a lot of, CIOs and whatnot might fear is, okay, a new technology paradigm comes along and I have to throw away all my old, some people call them legacy systems, some people call them systems of record, and start from scratch. And what I hear you saying is no, blockchain can sit on top of that or beside it, whatever way you want to draw it, and basically just be used to connect it to other parties securely. Is that fair?
For the time being, that's fair. And I mean, it's important to understand that blockchain is very new. Yeah. It was unveiled in 2008. When we think about the maturity curve of the internet, no one could have foreseen the various applications that we use today. The Twitters, the Facebooks, the LinkedIn, the Snapchats, etc. And so there's an expectation that the technology will be maturing over the next couple of years. And right now, it's really important for companies to start wrapping their heads around what the implications are of this today in anticipation of what will happen in 1 year, 2 years, 3, 5 years down the line. And so most of the companies that we're seeing are in the early proof of concept or POC phases where they're looking at prototyping and testing out the ideas and figuring out, is blockchain the solution for this problem? And it's not always the case. Many people will try to characterize this as the silver bullet solution. And it's not. It's not.
It's part of the hype cycle,
It's part of the hype cycle. And there's a lot of weeding out through what is applicable and what is not applicable. And is a traditional database actually better to suit my needs than a new shiny blockchain system?
So let's stay on the technology a little bit. So is there besides Bitcoin, which I think everybody can relate to. And like you say, that's public. I could go home tonight and buy some Bitcoin. I'm not going to, but I could. Are there other similar scale public examples or public instances of blockchain networks, or is that the main public one right now that basically anybody can participate in?
Right now, I would say that the two biggest camps is the Bitcoin blockchain on one side and the Ethereum protocol on the other. Okay. We are seeing the emergence of a couple of other protocols that would be at that open source, fully distributed level. IBM recently is working with the Linux Foundation as part of their Open Ledger project, and we're really excited to see how that evolves and what approach they end up taking. Okay. And so fundamentally, there's always this question of, will there be one blockchain to rule them all? Will there be multiple blockchains designed for different reasons? And I don't have a crystal ball, and anyone that says they do, well, we always doubt those predictions.
Grab your wallet, right? Yeah.
Hold on to your wallet. So we're waiting to see how that industry evolves and who are the various players that come out. And right now, most companies are operating at different levels of that vertical stack, from core infrastructure to more of the tools designers to the service providers and the application developers.
Yeah, so let's talk about Ethereum then. So is Ethereum just a reference design, or is Ethereum actually a complete network that you can plug yourself into, and actually, as long as the parties that you want to do business with or party also plugs into it, that it can work? Like, is it a framework? Is it a network that's online and ready to go? Which all of the above, none of the above?
Ethereum is actually live. It's an open protocol. It's fully distributed. And in terms of market mass, it's one of the top 3 protocols that are currently being used. Okay. So today, if you wanted to create a node on the Ethereum network, you could absolutely do that. There are actually a couple of cloud service providers that are aligning themselves to allow for that simpler deployment. Obviously, it's a complex process. As a non-developer, I don't recommend trying to set this up, but an experienced full stack developer can absolutely get set up directly on the Ethereum network and participate with the overall network. You brought up a comment of being able to connect directly to another known party that you're aware of. And you could do that, but that would require a private Ethereum instance. And that's the private network
so
configuration.
Since this is public, anybody that's on there can see kind of what you're doing?
Exactly. So in public networks, you can see all of the transactions that have unfolded. However, all of the transactions are coded. And so unless you're one of the 2 parties to a transaction, you can't actually see the details, but you could see, you can just go on like a blockchain.info and see all of the transactions that have happened and the time and the amount that was sent without actually knowing the full details of who was involved on both sides.
Okay. So you mentioned that Ethereum is one of the top 3. So what are the other 2?
So we have a number of alternative currencies that are currently available that are very similar to the Bitcoin protocol. And if you look at Shapeshift, it's one of the companies that kind of tracks all of the movements of the various exchanges. They list all of the open source fully distributed protocols and the amount of the market cap. And obviously it fluctuates on a daily basis based on market movements, but you'll see all of the major players.
Okay. Good. So that's good. Now, is there an aspect here? Again, if you go back to, I'm just picking databases just because it's a technology that went through an evolution. So at some point, for example, businesses realized that, and I think it was IBM that came out with this idea of a relational database. And then there was a structured query language that was built as standard. So, the other thing I'm interested in from a technology perspective is, are there similar standards that will emerge in terms of blockchains and how participants will interact? Are there any bodies that are creating? Another example would be the W3 for the World Wide Web, right? Are there any parties like that are helping to say, okay, listen, if we're all going to work together on these blockchains, here's the rules of engagement and version, 1.0 of the standards, and then you got version 1.1. Is that happening or too early yet, or?
It is actually happening, and I was surprised back in the fall of 2014 when I stumbled across C4. They are the Cryptocurrency Certification Consortium.
Good.
Try saying that four times
exactly.
over.
Yeah, well done.
And they were very thoughtful in recognizing that, wait, we don't have any standards when it comes to the Bitcoin blockchain and what it takes to interact with Bitcoin blockchain as a company. Right now in the ecosystem, you have Bitcoin exchanges that convert fiat currencies and allow you to enter the Bitcoin network. You have companies that are involved in private key storage. How do you ensure that each of these businesses that ends up affecting a consumer is following the right set of processes internally? And they've set out on creating the CCSS, the cryptocurrency security standards that govern that relationship. In the wake of the launch of Ethereum, it was really in the summer of 2015, fairly recent. This organization is also working to create the certification standards for an Ethereum smart contract developer. So how do you know that the person you're dealing with is actually technologically capable and knows how to build a smart contract? Previous to that, they issued the CBP designation, Certified Bitcoin Professional. I went through this process over a year ago of getting certified, and it essentially means that you understand the fundamentals of Bitcoin, how the system operates, and some of the best practices around it. So slowly but surely, this organization is worldwide. They're closely connected to the open source community. They are creating the best case scenarios and processes to follow.
And just for our listeners, I find it amazing you're able to pull those acronyms out of your head. Iliana is not using any notes or anything here, so that's pretty amazing. So what else is there to talk about with regards to, I call it the plumbing or the technical infrastructure? Like, if a company wants to participate either in a private or public, they need some coders with some skill sets. They need to understand encryption. Like, can you give me an overview of, let's say you were working with me and you were consulting with my small company, and I was trying to get connected to a blockchain. Like, what are some of the technical issues that we'd have to deal with, to enable that?
Sure. So, from my experience, a full stack developer that has a keen interest in distributed technologies and has a background in security and a background in encryption, algorithms, and data structures, they can very easily learn to wrap their head around the blockchain. There's a learning curve. Absolutely. But we have one of my colleagues, one of my co-founders actually, used to mine Bitcoin back in his university dorm room because the electricity costs of running the computational requirements were all covered. Today, creating a Bitcoin node in your home office from an economic standpoint likely does not make sense because of the computing power and the energy required. But that's not to say that you can't create a light node that isn't running a full instance of the blockchain and participating and verifying all of the transactions by executing complex mathematical computations. You can run that thin client that has a copy of the blockchain without actually participating fully in it. So there are different ways of getting involved. And the same goes for Ethereum. You could not very easily, but you can set up an instance of Ethereum in your own environment. We tend to use a Linux environment. We find that it's very compatible. So you can set up an Ethereum instance and participate, and off you go. When it comes to creating a private blockchain implementation, there are a lot of considerations that need to be involved from a design perspective. And it all comes down to the use case that you're looking at. And so part of what we do is we work with our clients to figure out, what are you trying to build? And before that, what is your business problem? And depending on the desired outcomes, we know that there are trade-offs between performance, so how quickly transactions can be processed in a network, and privacy and security, because of course, the more distributed your network, the more secure your network. But the more distributed your network, the slower the transaction the transaction times. So it's all of those considerations that we need to review as part of the configuration of the private network.
So let's use a fun example here. We're recording a podcast here. One problem which is getting solved, and in many cases solved, certainly more in the U.S. than in Canada. But one problem that podcasters have, for example, is connecting with their audience, and their audience may be interested, may see some value in the podcast that they're getting. But just like you said, with the electricity and whatnot, the transactional costs. So let's say a listener of this podcast wanted to say, I want to donate $3. I really like that episode on blockchain. Well, if they have to pay $1.75 for a funds transfer, that really puts a barrier. So could we use that as a simplistic example to say, could blockchain be used to remove some of the friction from allowing a podcast audience to support the podcaster without, like I say, some percentage of their money being kind of soaked up, like you say, by one of these third parties? Is that, like, I know it might be a simplistic example, but could that work?
Absolutely. That's one of the promises of the Bitcoin blockchain, is the ability to send these micro transactions in a way that's actually affordable. Yeah. In fact, there's a company out there, ChangeTip, and their entire business model was on the premise of doing these small tips for the service providers and the newspaper writers to help support those artistic efforts. Exactly. From a more complicated perspective, but a really cool use case that I quite enjoy, is an initiative called Ujo Music. And the idea behind this initiative is that music, when it's produced, includes the songwriter, it includes the singer, it includes the violinist in the background, it includes the pianist and the guitarist. Today, the singer goes and gets signed by a record label. The record label owns the rights to the song, and once the song is played on the radio, they record that, and royalties are then issued to the people participating in this song producing process. However, that can often take months or years before the actual payment is made. And what Ujo Music allows via smart contracts is essentially a user who downloads a song, let's say on Apple iTunes, and they pay 99 cents. Out of those 99 cents, the user can see right away the funds being distributed into the wallets of each of the people who has rights to that song. So let's say the singer gets 50%, the songwriter gets 15%, the violinist gets 5%, and the rest is distributed to the sound crew, etc. And so that's a real life application. They had a partnership with Imogen Heap, and she released a song directly onto this platform that you can go and download today.
So to do that, circling back then, did they use Ethereum or did they implement their own blockchain technology, or what?
So Ujo is an implementation of the Ethereum protocol. So they're using that smart contract. And the smart contract is really just that business logic that allows you to predefine, once a payment is made for the song and it's downloaded, then automatically issue payment to recipient A, B, C, and D.
Okay, good. That's good. So, I know you work in your work here with a lot of, like you say, proofs of concepts and stuff. Without giving away any secrets or anything, are there any other examples that you can share of the types of applications that people are, like you say, maybe just considering, right, or doing some R&D on? Like, are there any other examples you can share?
One really big one that I find is fascinating is the concept of identity management. Because at the end of the day, your ID is something that you port everywhere. You use it as the key to get access to a whole suite of services, whether it's you opening a bank account, requesting a credit card from a different bank account, or going in for public sector services. Today, we give our individual information to all of these different government groups and non-government groups individually, and they have no way of sharing that information. And so if I have an account today with Bank ABC and I go to open an account with Bank CDO tomorrow, I have to go through that whole KYC, so know your client process, twice, which means bringing a copy of my passport and my driver's license and a proof of address and a hydro bill. All of these processes that are inefficient from the bank's perspective, it takes each of the banks 3 days to access all of this information.
Right.
Whereas there are a number of initiatives underway right now to allow me as an individual to record my information on the blockchain and be issued a digital identity. And then this digital identity could theoretically be verified by, let's say, the government of Canada, that then signs that transaction with their private key. So next time I go to the bank to open an account, they can query the blockchain, which is a fully accessible network, and find out that, yes, Iliana Oris Valiente is who she says she is. This information was validated by Passport Canada. And all of a sudden, you've just removed that KYC process for Bank ABC and Bank CDO. So that's one application that I find is just mind-boggling. Another one that we've been spending some time looking at is in the automotive sector when it comes to supply chain management. And you think of a car, as soon as it exits off of the assembly line, being represented by a digital token, such that after I sell my car, I'm essentially transferring both the physical ownership and the digital token to the recipient directly, without necessarily having to go to the local Ministry of Transportation that only has records for cars that were purchased and registered in the province of Ontario. And if the manufacturer realizes that there's a defect with the car, well, there's all of a sudden a traceable record of where this car may have ended up and the ability to send a notification that's flagged to a specific make and model of a car that was manufactured and sold within a specific time period to alert me anonymously that, hey, I might have to take my car in, my engine is faulty, or my airbags are faulty, or there's something else that needs to be replaced on the vehicle. And when you think about that, plus the various insurance companies involved and the various places where I might go to get my car repaired, how do you create a holistic picture of the story and the history of a car using a publicly distributed ledger that doesn't require all of these individual parties to completely change their underlying technologies and processes?
Yeah, that's good. And then if we go back to the identity example, because that one's very intriguing, do you still maintain, because it's your identity, so do you still maintain control over who can see that and use that identity? Like, do you have to, when you, let's say you go to open up a bank account or something, do you have to authorize that bank to access your identity so it gives you more control as well? Okay.
Absolutely. So the idea here is that the end user regains control over their own identity in the same way that as an end user that has a wallet that has cash, if I lose my $20 of cash, no one's going to find it for me, but I hold on to it. And so if I go to the bank, then it would be a matter of, they can query the blockchain, absolutely. But in order to be able to unlock that transaction and see the details, I would have to sign off using my private key that I would only give to the party that is interested in seeing information. The other thing about the blockchain is that you can program tokens to have certain criteria of what is displayed. And so theoretically, I could have different levels of view access that I grant to different parties depending on what they need to see. So my insurance company, yes, needs to know my medical details. Do they need to see my financial details? Not necessarily. My bank, conversely, do they need to know that I have a medical record? Sure. Do they need to see the details of the medical procedures I've done? Absolutely not.
Yeah, and you can control that. Excellent, excellent. So what, like, if you were to, I know, like you say, you've got no crystal ball, but if you were to guess based on, the activity that you're seeing in the market and whatnot, the kind of some stages or when, we as everyday consumers would start to see more of the companies, let's say, that we interact with, and governments and whatnot actually implementing some of this technology. What are your thoughts? Like you've already said that financial services seems to be like an early adopter here. Healthcare records. So, just as a consumer, is it going to be like 4 or 5 years before I start to see some of the implications of this? Because there's a lot of value here for the end consumer, right? Potentially my rates could go down, because there's less friction, or my service provider's profits go up, but maybe I get more control, so when do you think we as consumers of these services will start to actually see some of this stuff in the wild, as they like to say?
The consumer perspective is tricky. Today, you can be directly influenced by the Bitcoin blockchain, absolutely. Even by Ether. I could go today, convert more fiat currency into Bitcoin and send you money tomorrow. And if you're based in the Philippines, or you're based in India, or you're based in the US even, I can use that to transfer money to you effectively. Consumer benefit, absolutely. For all of the other applications, right now we've seen the hype circle of companies wanting to figure out, what is this blockchain thing? What do I need to know? In many organizations, I'm seeing this interesting phenomenon of someone being tapped on the shoulder and being told, so you are going to be our blockchain representative.
Exactly.
Please figure out what on earth this means for our business. Off you go. So from that perspective, we're going to see a lot of prototyping happening in the next couple of months. And we're seeing that today in terms of our pipeline and where the client interest really is. And I suspect that this prototyping phase will probably last another year, at least, as companies try to filter out what use cases make sense and which ones are less of a priority and less likely to happen in the near future. Government adoption, I suspect, is going to be a little bit longer. There is a lot of personal information that's at stake, a lot of legacy systems, but I've been very pleasantly surprised by the level of activity coming from a number of developed countries and some developing countries. Honduras is a great example, that are fully embracing the technology and figuring out, can we use this to leapfrog
exactly
a legacy set of systems, whether it's the way I do my real estate titles, or in the way that I help people without an identity, without identity documents, become a part of the formal banking economy. So banking the unbanked is one of those examples. I think that that's a use case that we're likely to see materializing in the nearer term future. But things related to a bank and their infrastructure for back-end settlements, I don't know if that will have as immediate an effect on the end consumer. Not until you start seeing some of these larger monetary reductions of costs from the infrastructure of some of these banks. There was a report issued earlier this year that suggested $20 billion worth of savings in IT costs from banks after implementing blockchain systems. But that assumes perfect adoption, figuring out all of the small kinks that will exist as part of this process and the learning pains. And it assumes several years out.
Yeah. And I imagine the other thing is that the larger incumbents, who have built their business and are making profits based on the current structure, you can almost see them sometimes having a conflict of interest in the sense that, okay, if we're going to tear down this old infrastructure and implement this new one, then is that going to mean there's much less opportunity for me to charge, to charge my transaction fees or what have you? Do you see that at all? That some companies or some industries being threatened by this technology, or are the cost savings just too great
I would say yes and no.
I'll use an analogy just so you understand where I'm going. Look at how long electric cars have been around, right? Literally decades, right? Even though it's the newest cool, even if you're on a social network every day these days, there's news coming out, but they've been literally around for decades. Why hasn't the adoption been faster? a conspiracy theorist would say, well, the oil industry and the auto industry are doing just fine, thank you very much. So they don't have a vested interest in, promoting a technology that, is going to kind of, eat their lunch, so to speak. Any of that, or do you think that it's all upside for current incumbents? Or you'd rather not say because...
No, I can answer the question. And I think when Bitcoin first came out, there was a lot of hesitation from the large financial institutions of, is this going to eat my lunch?
Yeah.
Is my role as a financial intermediary going to be completely uprooted? Yeah. But the more time I've spent in this industry, and 18 months is an eternity in this space, given how quickly it's moving, the attitude has really shifted in recognizing financial intermediaries as we know them today are not going to go away anytime soon. Mm-hmm. They serve a very valuable purpose, and there are so many intricacies in the way that transactions are done and the various types of financial products that blockchain is not going to completely wipe them out at all. Right. Is it going to offer a new option for money remittances? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So that's one type of product that you could absolutely see being threatened. And a lot of banks are looking at how can they use blockchain as an improvement in the way that they do remittances to reduce the overall cost of operating their legacy systems. Mm-hmm. And the reason that we pay so much in transaction fees today is because we're paying for all of this legacy infrastructure that still exists. Mm-hmm. But because the banks are looking at removing or replacing some of that infrastructure, I think that there is an opportunity for upside. The biggest difference I see between the electric car and the resistance to adoption and blockchain is the fact that it influences more than one industry. So with the electric car, you can list off the manufacturers and the parts, components, and the oil industry. Whereas blockchain is poised to disrupt or change, rather, so many industries that no one has a particularly vested interest in keeping things in that status quo. It's quite the opposite, where companies are waking up and industries are waking up and saying, wait, you mean we're not doing something about this and everyone else is? And with any new technology, I mean, the internet displaced certain jobs, but created new opportunities elsewhere. And we see that happening across the board in pushing for more value-adding type roles, as opposed to more of the traditional footing and tying or like database kind of entry work, because things on the whole are going to be more efficient.
No, that's a good answer. And as you were talking there, I was kind of thinking that, yeah, the internet is probably the better example in the sense that the internet came along, had a lot of these same characteristics, distributed, and all of that. So one way is to say, well, yeah, the internet affected all businesses, and this blockchain is really just, can be viewed as just a layer on top of the internet. That means you don't have to think about a lot of these issues about trust and privacy, and have all these different companies implement kind of point-to-point business relationships. Instead, they can use this standard called a blockchain. So it's maybe just another evolution of the internet as far as business is concerned.
It's an enabling technology.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely.
Good stuff. Well, I want to respect your time here, Iliana. The last topic I have on this is, if we've got some younger folks listening to the podcast who are really intrigued with this, and maybe they're an entrepreneur, or maybe they just want to make sure that they can get a job and work in this field, what kind of suggestions would you have? You mentioned earlier, but maybe you can just recap it, that you need to understand security and encryption. You need to understand maybe the ideas of distributed ledgers. Like, what if you were to give like a 5 or 6 point kind of study assignment, if somebody's listening and wanted to become that expert in their company on blockchain, what would you recommend they do in terms of studying up?
Great. So there are a couple of different avenues that you could take.
Right.
I mean, I'm not a technologist by training.
Sure.
I'm not going to sit at the computer and build the new smart contract application.
Yep.
But there is definitely a role, and I think this product management podcast is the appropriate audience to bring that business savvy element and understanding what your business does, what are the limitations of your business, where are the problems, and what do you wish technology could enable. So you take that aspect and you combine it with an understanding of what is blockchain. So go back, find that white paper by Satoshi. If you have a technical background, I encourage you to read it beginning to end. If you don't have a fully technical background, read the first 5 pages to get a gist of what they're talking about. There are plenty of videos. Khan Academy has a couple on YouTube that explain Bitcoin 101. Once you have a good grasp of that, go and poke around the Ethereum website. Go look at some of the projects that use Ethereum that give you ideas about the various use cases. If you can think of a use case, there's probably someone out there that's in the process of building it. So the opportunity for you as the listener becomes in taking that information and applying it to your specific business, to your specific industry. If you happen to be a technologist by training, and you have a background in data structures and algorithms and in encryption and in security, and you have an interest in distributed ledgers, then yes, go back and read that full white paper in detail. There are a number of technologies that are emerging on top of Ethereum and on top of the Bitcoin blockchain. And really, depending on your interests, you can find so much reading material that you will never resurface from the rabbit hole. And that's what I call it, where you start with reading one article and then it hyperlinks you to somewhere else. And next thing you know, it's 3:00 in the morning and you're still on your blockchain binge and you feel like you know less than when you started. And that's normal.
And then in terms of where they might be able to apply this knowledge, let's say even here locally in Toronto or in any big city, is it fair to say that you would probably see more jobs and more opportunities in financial services? Like we said, that's the beachhead it seems to be for this technology?
Absolutely. Not just in financial services, but there is a huge demand right now for blockchain talent, and it's scarce. So those who have an interest in the technology, I highly encourage you to go and read up on it. Most organizations, ours included, are always on the lookout for bright, talented developers that can help bring some of these ideas to life. And that's really, I think, what 2016 is going to be all about. Going beyond talking and education and ideation to something real, something that you can bring back in the form of a prototype with a functioning UI and show it to your board of advisors and show it to your management to say, listen, this is real and this is how it's going to impact us. It goes a long way. Good.
Okay, so just one more fun question before we get off of the technology. So I remember, can't remember if it was a podcast or online, but how would I call it? This mystery is this person that you mentioned, Satoshi. Yeah, whether this was an individual, whether this person really exists. At one point, that somebody had thought that they had found him, but then it wasn't actually him. So, have you got any update on that? Does he really exist, or was he maybe just a collection of people using that pseudonym? Have you heard anything about that?
I wish I knew the answer, but Satoshi, wherever you are, thank you.
Exactly.
You have given legions of computer engineers and software developers and business folk so much to think about in the past couple of years. I don't think he knew or she knew what they were getting themselves into.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Okay, last question that I always ask all my guests, Iliana. So, you're still fairly early in your career, but if you were to go back 5 or 10 years, based on what you've learned in your career so far, and thinking of somebody maybe 5 or 10 years earlier in their career that's listening to the podcast, what advice would you give? Like, what are some of the things that you've learned that if you had to do it all over again, like I said, even though you're still fairly early on in your career, what advice would you give to somebody starting out in terms of getting off in the right direction and maybe avoiding some missteps?
One thing that I would likely have changed is the way I approached the educational system. And I'm one of those people, I'm very academically inclined. You give me a course, you give me an exam, and I will ace it. But one of the challenges, and I see this firsthand today, is that our educational curriculum is always based on tried and true technologies, methods, and concepts, which means that even if you are the top student in your class, by the time you graduate, there are new trends and technologies emerging that you simply weren't aware of. And it becomes a learning curve and almost a shock of, wow, I had no idea that this way of thinking really existed. And so the concept of product management, for example, I had no idea that that was an area that you could have gone into and you could have taken courses in a couple of forward-thinking specialized universities. And I went through a commerce program where, yes, we had technology courses, but they were always based on IT and the technology within an organization, as opposed to graduating and a couple of years later really stumbling onto the concept of exponential technologies and things that are evolving, AI, the inflection of the Internet of Things, and some of these other domains that are going to be so disruptive. But the only way to truly build subject matter expertise is to have found out about these things ahead of time on your own by listening to podcasts, by reading the tech blogs, and doing a lot of extracurricular activities that are related to content. So a couple of years ago, had I paid more attention to some of these unorthodox topics, I very likely would have started taking computer programming courses at that outset, not with the aim of becoming a computer developer. That's not my core competency, but the ability to be able to communicate with the various people who are building the technologies and to be able to provide that business guidance, I think is really valuable. Whereas now I find myself doing that, but in a very informal fashion.
Yeah, no, that's good. I've heard a lot of people suggest that coding should be part of the basic curriculum. Like you say, not everybody's going to become a coder, but it, you know, as they say, software is eating the world. So it's good to just be able to relate to it, and communicate with people. That's good advice. So Iliana, if somebody heard something that you said and was intrigued and wanted to follow up with you, or just want to follow you in general, what contact and follow type information are you comfortable sharing with the audience? Like, how can people follow you, learn more about what you're doing, get in contact with you?
Well, one of the benefits of my name is that it's very unique. I happen to be the only Iliana Oris Valiente in this world.
Wow, amazing.
So if you
Not
Google
too many
me,
people can say that.
Exactly. You will find me. I'm available on Twitter. So follow me there. I tweet about lots of random things. If you're interested more on the blockchain side, you can reach out to me via my Twitter, Iliana OV, or track me down at the Rubix website, Rubix, so I can easily be contacted through there. And of course, if you want to find out a little bit more about me, LinkedIn. So I feel like everyone these days is on that medium, so you can easily find me there.
Good, and I'm going to try to spell that for our listeners. So it's ILIANA space ORIS space VALIENTE.
That's right. Yay!
Gold star. So Iliana Oris Valiente, on behalf of Ready Product Radio and our listeners, thank you very much for this. I'm sure we could talk for another 3 hours on this topic. So, hopefully, at some point, maybe we can do another check-in and see, maybe another 6 months or so, see how the technologies evolve. But on behalf of our listeners, thanks for spending the time with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Today's podcast was brought to you by Eigenworks. Eigenworks specializes in win-loss analysis and customer development as a service. Get candid feedback to improve your sales approach, uncover competitive intelligence, and help you pivot as needed. Thank you for listening to this episode of Ready Product Radio, part of the Ready PDM network. This is when most podcasters ask you to leave a review on iTunes if you like the show. My only request is if you found the show entertaining, inspiring, or informative, please share it with a colleague or friend who may feel the same way. Also, note that the views expressed in this episode do not necessarily reflect my views or the views of the Ready PDM network. If you want yourself or your product to be ready, then keep your eyes on your markets, your ears to your customers, your mind on their experiences, both good and bad, and finally, keep your hearts in your products. Until next time, thank you for listening. You can contact us on Twitter at Ready Product Radio. That's RDYPRODUCTRADIO. And on the web at www.readyproductradio.com.
Gee, mate, what do you want to do tonight?
The same thing we do every night, Pinky. Try to take over the world.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.